as well as the occupation of our land. And this day is a special one. It's a day on which we also remember the millions of our forebears who were sold across the Atlantic to endure intolerable cruelty and misery so that others may amass huge wealth and privilege. It is when we remember the millions more who were enslaved, who were also indentured. Even here in South Africa, when many of our compatriots from India were indentured here and were exploited in a number of countries on our continent so that powerful colonial countries may be enriched and take what does not belong to them. Now, these atrocities, like many others throughout humanity, have been perpetrated against many people around the world, and they enable people to claim dominion over other people. These atrocities, like many others throughout, these atrocities were driven by the logic of colonialism, where what belongs to another person may be expropriated simply because that person belongs to another supposedly inferior race. If the aim of colonial conquest is theft, then race is its justification. It was this sense of entitlement and superiority that enabled European settlers to cast aside the inalienable rights of North Americans, Aboriginal Australians, the Maori, the Inuit, and many other native peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. It was this sense of entitlement that enabled the creation and sustenance of apartheid here in our own country, South Africa. As many countries of Africa and Asia achieved their independence from the middle of the 20th century, apartheid South Africa remained an outpost of racial oppression and economic exploitation. Yet, despite the retreat of colonialism and imperialism, and despite the end of apartheid, despite the great progress that has been made in forging a global community of independent and equal nations, race remains a defining feature of many societies. As we know from our own experience, racism has economic, social, cultural, psychological, and many other dimensions. And each of these dimensions reinforces the other. It is a layer upon layer upon layer of dimensions and manifestations. South Africa is a country that's defined by racial inequality. Even after 26 years of democracy, the country's wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few, predominantly white people, while the poor and unemployed are overwhelmingly Black. In almost every metric of human development, from education to healthcare, from nutrition to life expectancy, you will find a huge difference between Black and white South Africans without fail. And that chasm continues to exist and it persists. The inequality and poverty becomes even more stark when gender is considered, with the material circumstances of women, but African women in particular, where it becomes even more severe. And as I've said, in certain situations, that poverty and inequality wears a black face. And that face is the face of an African woman. Economic inequality reinforces other forms of inequality. It affects a number of practices, cultural. It affects a whole number of areas of human existence. It has a psychological effect that few would be willing to admit, imbuing those with wealth with a sense of entitlement, and those without with a sense of perpetual inferiority. It was Steve Biko who said, material want is bad enough, but coupled with spiritual poverty, it kills. He recognized that it was the purpose of apartheid not only to dispossess black people of their land, of their livelihoods, and their labor, but also to deprive them of their dignity, to destroy their confidence and self-worth as well. While apartheid has gone, its legacy of inequality, of poverty, of displacement from what life has to offer to human beings continues to have a similar effect on how people perceive themselves and each other. And so it develops a certain sense of inevitability about the relative privilege and poverty of Black and white South Africans and of men and women. And it is this sense of the natural order of things that requires constant and consistent exposure. It is this that requires critique on an ongoing basis. It is this that we need to fathom. And it is this that we need to condemn on an ongoing basis. And it is this that we need to oppose and correct. It is this sense of the natural order of things that encourages white South Africans to racist outbursts, where you find white South Africans thinking that they have the license to call Black people monkeys, where they caricature Black people in our own country with animals. It is this that enables Black academics to be overlooked for promotion in our institutions of higher learning. That enables labor tenants to be evicted from their land. But that also enters the home field as well, that encourages men to abuse their wives. And that makes it possible the killing of a Black man by a white police officer on an American street. It is this that speaks to the natural order of things that needs to be challenged and to be broken. We need to acknowledge that racism and related forms of intolerance are not only to be found in the behavior of individuals. They permeate institutions, communities, and societies. And they are manifested in the 21st century in many other ways. Racism is one of the fundamental underpinnings of modern slavery, which confines many people to forced labor and servitude. It persists in the atrocities committed against peoples across the world, as witnessed, for instance, during the Rwandan genocide, the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, and more recently, the persecution of the Rohingya in Myanmar, it is this capacity to deny the equal humanity of all other people that lies at the heart of the continued occupation by Israel of the Palestinian land. It has taken as an implicit justification for the continued denial to the Palestinian people of their right to self-determination and liberty. It is this toxic mix of chauvinistic economic interests and the arrogance of racial, ethnic, and national superiority that stands in the way of the achievement of the independence of Western Sahara. And racism shares a fundamental characteristics with other forms of discrimination and intolerance. And it is based on the dehumanization of the other. The oppression of women is founded on the completely fabricated belief that women constitute a lower form of being than men, a belief that is reinforced by various religious, cultural, and social norms. It is a belief that manifests itself in economic marginalization, but also in discrimination as well as domination. But ultimately, it also manifests itself in brute force and violence against those who are perceived as being unlike us. It is the dehumanization of others that creates fertile ground for xenophobia, for the religious intolerance, for those who have Islamophobia as well, and anti-Semitism, and for ethnic rivalry and violence as well. It makes possible the discrimination and even violence that is directed at people on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity. That explains the marginalization of people also with albinism, who are otherwise considered different from others. Intolerance is an enabler of brutality, of oppression, of neglect, and indifference. This is true of the experiences of Black and Indigenous communities in many countries across the world, where racial profiling by law enforcement authorities and disproportionate use of violence is common. But I would argue a similar process of dehumanization is at work where those in positions of power violate the rights of vulnerable people in all societies. The unjustified use of violence by security forces against civilians, including in our own country, is one such example. The death of Collins Khoza and 10 other South Africans reportedly at the hands of our security forces during COVID-19 is something that I deeply regret. I regret it because as we introduced or imposed the lockdown, I specifically spoke to our security forces and said that they must go out amongst our people with love in their hearts and must not treat fellow South Africans as the enemy. Now, unfortunately, to my deepest regret, a number of our compatriots have lost their lives. And that is something that really saddens me. These cases are now being investigated by the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, and the other one in Khoza's case. There are a number of other structures within our military and the police that must go to the bottom of this. I will not agree that we have seen the end of this. We will spare no effort in ensuring that those responsible are brought to justice and face the full might of the law. While they do not have the obvious racial dimensions of the murder of George Floyd, they do rely on a similar contempt for the intrinsic human worth of the victim. Such acts must be condemned just as vehemently and must be combated with equal intensity. The same applies in different ways and often to a different extent to those who steal public funds destined for the poor, to those public officials who ignore the plight of those they are entrusted to serve, and those companies that are prepared to endanger the lives and the health of their workers to maximize profit. As the world acknowledged at the UN World Conference Against Racism in Durban in 2001, the struggle against racism and related intolerances must be a relentless struggle. We must develop systematic programs to tackle it, both nationally and on a global level as well, based on an understanding that all human beings are created equal and must be seen as being equal before the law, regardless of status in life, regardless of religion, regardless of color, regardless of everything else. The first step must always be to acknowledge the existence of the challenge. In doing so, we must allow ourselves to be guided by those that are affected by discrimination. These communities are best placed to understand and explain the complexities of their own situation, their own challenges, and what measures they believe are required to address their plight. We must ensure that those who suffer intolerance are given a voice. We must make allowance for the intersectionality of discrimination. One individual can be discriminated against based on their race, gender, ethnicity, and the multiplicity of factors. Each of these factors does require redress. Governments and multilateral bodies have a range of instruments at their disposal to tackle all forms of racism and discrimination. Programs that are aimed at affirming and strengthening the rights of vulnerable communities and promoting access to things such as healthcare services, education, economic opportunities are critical to the achievement of greater equality. We must therefore continue to collaborate on global strategies to stamp out racism, to combat human trafficking, religious intolerance, and xenophobia. Governments must act against perpetrators of all acts of racism and intolerance. The bigger question is what we can do as ordinary citizens to combat racism and related discrimination. Education and awareness programs are amongst the biggest and most vital tools at our disposal. We must promote respect for diversity amongst all peoples of the world, respect and tolerance for other cultures, other religions and beliefs. And we must also be promoting a deeper understanding and knowledge of the histories of other peoples, their cultures, so that we can learn to appreciate where all of us come from. In that way, we will then be able to be more understanding, more tolerant, more respectful, more embracing. We must not be afraid to call out racists or xenophobes or homophobes and other bigots in our communities. If we see the extent to which the world has now reacted to naked racism in the United States, I firmly believe that this is a moment that we must regard as a turning point with regard to tackling racism across the world. We must stand firm against the daily acts of racism and microaggressions directed at Black men, Black women, Black children in the workplace, in the streets, places of learning across society. As the people of South Africa, we are guided in this task by the Freedom Charter, which makes the bold assertion that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, Black and white. This is the fundamental truth that underpins our struggle for a non-racial society. And in the end, our adherence to non-racialism should never be seen as a tactic. Like reconciliation, it has never been about placating the erstwhile oppressor. Non-racialism and indeed non-sexism are about building a fundamentally different society, the antithesis of our apartheid and colonial past. This requires that the political, social, cultural, mental, and economic edifice of institutionalized racism must be demolished, and that a just and equal society must be built in its place. And we must continue on this task. As we forge ahead with this task, we remember that the struggle of our freedom was not our own, but in the cause of liberation of all who suffer under tyranny and oppression. As the United States finds itself in this moment of crisis, we remember that African Americans, like many other compatriots, stood by us in our darkest hour. The civil rights movement in the United States inspired our own struggle, and its leaders galvanized international support for us. We owe them a great debt, and we stand in solidarity with them today, tomorrow, and into the future. And we believe that human dignity is a universal aspiration, and that respect for the rights and dignity of every human being is the only guarantee of any nation's prosperity. As I conclude, I turn again to the words of Steve Biko, who said, "We have set out on a quest for true humanity, and somewhere on the distant horizon, we can see the glittering prize. Let us march forth with courage and determination, drawing strength from our common plight and our brotherhood and sisterhood," he would have added today. In time, we shall be in a position to bestow upon South Africa the greatest gift possible, a more human face. Steve Bantu Biko, the author of these powerful words of hope and determination, died in a prison cell, as we know, in 1977. A Black man murdered by a white policeman. And it is important that we remember this as the whole world unites against the death of George Floyd. His death and the deaths of so many others have not diminished our quest for a true humanity. They have not weakened our resolve. Instead, they have brought forth from within our collective being a relentless desire for justice, for peace, for understanding, and for equality. I thank you, comrades. Thank you. Thank you.
The president of the ANC, Cyril Ramaphosa, launching that anti-racism campaign, of course, announced yesterday by Jesse Duarte of the ANC, indicating, of course, all the solidarity for the killing of George Floyd in the United States. And the president also saying that he deeply regrets the deaths of Collins Khoza and others, not just Collins Khoza, who has died at the hands of law enforcement agencies here in South Africa since the lockdown started, but others too. Their names are being called out on various platforms over the past couple of days. And the president there indicating that he believes that this will be a turning point in the fight against racism, not just in South Africa, but around the world. We're going to try and take you back there in the next few moments. And we're going to try and see how we connect to that in the next few moments as other speakers also take to the podium there or address in that launch of the anti-racism campaign by the ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa. We're going to take a short break now. We'll come back very shortly. We hope to take you back to that launch in the next few moments. Stay with us. Cyril Ramaphosa having addressed, indicating that he deeply regrets the deaths of Collins Khoza and others. Of course, as widespread condemnation has reverberated throughout the world over the killing of George Floyd in the United States. Amongst the other speakers also expected there tonight, we understand Yvonne Chaka Chaka, who's also partnering with UNICEF. She will speak there, as well as John Kani, our very own decorated here in South Africa and throughout the world. He'll also take to the podium there. Let's take you live there now.
Our two congresses, the African National Congress and the Indian National Congress, have shared a lot. We have fought together and acted in solidarity. And in today's world, when we look at the last century, the names which come to the fore, who actually inspired the struggle against racialism, colonialism, and for human rights and justice. Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and Martin Luther King. These are the names which continue to inspire. We have to go back to the younger generation, those of our fraternal parties like the ANC who are in government and those of us who are not. We have to be very clear that the coming months and years are going to be difficult. Therefore, how to form a global coalition or an alliance, as you have called it, alliance of people who stand up for morality, for principles, for justice, for tolerance, for acceptance. We fortunately live in societies. We are multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multilingual. That I would term as our richness and our strength, and not as weakness. And those who would like to break it have to be resisted at any cost. Many of us, Comrade President, you yourself, have had experience of mobilization, of people's movements and struggle. Perhaps what we never thought will be called upon to do so. What has happened in America is a call of action. And not take much time, because there is suffering all over. I am reminded of the words of one of yours, Archbishop Trevor Huddleston, 75th anniversary of the ANC, which we commemorated in a big way in India. When we use the word outrage against the injustices, atrocities, and the dehumanization that apartheid regime was doing, he said, outrage without action would be meaningless. How we plan that action? Intellectually, institutionally, as movements, as representatives of the people, elected, or the civil society representatives who help in informing, sensitizing the opinion of the societies so that the people stand up and give a call that we shall not accept this. The Indian National Congress is fully with the ANC in this initiative, and we will stand together, come what may, in this fight for justice, for humanity, and for equal rights. Thank you. I've said what I have to say.
Two, one.
All right. We're expecting more speakers to address there at the ANC's launch of that anti-racism campaign. Amongst the others, we're also expecting to address, there's the Congress of South African Trade Union President, Zingiswa Lusi, who will also take the podium there, as well as Dr. Bladem Zimande, who's the General Secretary of the South African Communist Party. In fact, that is him speaking right now. Let's go there live.
And distinguished fellow panelists, and also to congratulate our alliance for organizing this important event. The brutal killing of... can you hear me now? The brutal killing of George Floyd by a white policeman in Minneapolis has touched the world and indeed our country, touched a raw nerve, the reality of racism globally, and also still a sore point in our own country and a reality. Prior to 1994, before our democratic breakthrough, our alliance, our movement, our liberation movement placed a lot of emphasis on what we used to call the national question. That is the struggle to build a united nation by basically defeating the demon of racism and all other forms of prejudices. Today, as we live through this very, very brutal act, in South Africa, we are still dealing not just with the past legacy, but also the ongoing reality of racism. But of course, our approach has been, how do we build after apartheid national unity? How do we promote national reconciliation? And some have even used the word, how do we build a rainbow nation? As the South African Communist Party, we are very proud that since our formation in 1921, we threw our weight against colonialism, against racism, and national oppression. So today as well, we stand firmly in the trenches, together with all people who love peace and progress in South Africa, to fight racism and all other forms of prejudices in our country. Since 1994, we've made a lot of progress as a country, as our president has hinted. We've done away with all racially based legislation. But like in the United States, in many ways, we are faced with the reality that racism is a very structural process. It is very deeply ingrained in many of our societies. As the president said, it is deeply interlinked with economic inequalities, which in our country are still deeply racialized. Our economy, it's still a reality in South Africa, is still largely white dominated, not just in terms of ownership, but also in terms of skills and some of the very important skills that keep any economy going, like engineering, like finance, like legal, still dominated by big law firms. Government has done a lot to foster changes in this regard. But unfortunately, the reality is that that sphere of the private sector in our country that is not dependent on doing business with government, there's been very little change since 1994. That is why what happened to George Floyd has also touched a raw nerve in our country. The developments in the United States illustrate one very important thing, that despite the progress made through the civil rights movement, led by, amongst others, the Reverend Martin Luther King, but the structural features of racism in the United States has hardly been touched. And as we express our solidarity with the African American community, but also all other progressive forces in the United States and the world. We do that because we remember well one of the famous words of the late Reverend Martin Luther King, who once said, "In the end," I quote, "in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends," unquote. We wish today to say the best way to honor and remember someone like George Floyd is to intensify the struggle against racism in all its forms, as our president was saying, in its economic forms, its ideological forms, as well as all other forms of prejudices. That is why we are at least heartened by what we see as a non-racial protest movements in the streets of the United States and other major cities in the world, because racism will not only be defeated by Black people, but it will be defeated by an alternative, inclusive, non-racial movement. And also we commit ourselves as the South African Communist Party in memory of George Floyd and many other victims of racism, both in our country and in the rest of the world, to deepen our struggle for economic justice, as indeed it is the foundation of racism and all other forms of prejudices. Thank you very much. Thank you, Phoebe.
Dr. Bladen Zimande of the South African Communist Party, the General Secretary, taking the podium there, saying that we should be encouraged by what has happened there in the United States in that fight against racism, making reference again to the death of, at the hands of law enforcement in Minneapolis, George Floyd, and that, of course, sparking demonstrations around the world, but not just solidarity for the George Floyd, but for those here at home also who have been killed at the hands of law enforcement agencies. We're expecting, you'll see there in our little box there, the president of COSATU will begin her address. These, of course, being the ANC Alliance partners, who also, I would say, making their pledge to this launch of this anti-racism campaign, which is being launched by the ANC today. The president there in his capacity as president of the governing party here in South Africa. And we're expecting in the next few moments COSATU as well to also have their say in this anti-racism and anti-police brutality campaign. The alliance partners are all joining in on that. And we're also expecting the likes of Yvonne Chaka Chaka to also add her voice there, together with her partnership with UNICEF. And also John Kani, you know, of course, one of our own, very decorated here in South Africa, but also acclaimed around the world to also have his say. But one central issue at this point, which has sparked all of this, of course, the killing of George Floyd in the United States. So the ANC saying it's important to show solidarity to what is taking place in the United States of America, but not forgetting, of course, what has happened here at home. We heard the president of the ANC indicate that he is deeply, of course, regretful of what happened to Collins Khoza here in Alexandra Township. You would know today that the Defense Minister, Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula, basically in a statement indicating that the report that was finalized into what responsibility those SANDF members should take in the death of Collins Khoza. They've been absolved from that after a board of the SANDF had sat and looked into the allegations that have been made. Let's go back there now. The president of COSATU, Zingiswa Lusi, is speaking now.
We were all celebrating the Africa Day. And as a federation, we want to say that we are proud as COSATU that we were never silent against apartheid in our country, and we shall never be silent on apartheid in the United States of America or in Israel, and whenever it happens. And we believe strongly that this remains a crime against humanity. We do so equally condemn the painful killing of our countrymen and women here in our country. We remember Josiah Master, a Mozambican who was dragged by police behind a police van. We remember Andreas Titane, Collins Khoza, and others in our country. We also condemn the acts of racism that we have seen against Victor Mlotshwa, who was forced into a coffin. Tunzi Sibui, who was also assaulted and sustained head injuries. And was saying workers were also verbally abused by white men because those workers could not speak Afrikaans. And this happened near Stellenbosch. We also condemn the recent act of racism when our minister, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, was depicted as a baboon by a white man called Danny. And as a federation, we are saying we remain determined to root out unlawful acts of human rights abuse anywhere. We are also unapologetic in calling out this by its name. You call it racism, apartheid, or imperialism. And we are also saying that the US is the epicenter and belly of the beast that has condemned millions all over the world to the most horrendous acts of racism and subjugation. It runs a global empire and suffocation of humanity in every part of the world. As a federation, we stand firmly and clearly in rejection of racism, and we stand for full equality and dignity of all human beings. We are proud to have been practically leading struggles against racism, against patriarchy, tribalism, and regionalism inside and outside our own federation, in our workplaces, in the farms, in our communities, and in fighting for laws that outrightly criminalize this act. We are also saying that we affirm the dignity of our people wherever they are and call upon all workers all over the world to stand up and fight against the injustice and apartheid and racism. We also take note, as the president has said, the transformation that have taken place, but very slowly, in our police, including in the defense force. And we believe that a lot of work still needs to be done. But we are saying, President Ramaphosa, that workers can't breathe when inequality persists and there are no consequences for employers who blatantly disregard Employment Equity Act. Workers can't breathe when employers disregard the equal pay for work of equal value, which is a Convention 100 of the ILO that has been domesticated in our country under the Employment Equity Act. Workers can't breathe when Convention 190 on eliminating violence and harassment in the world of work is still not ratified and domesticated. And as a federation and workers in this country, we're calling for ratification of this convention. Workers can't breathe, President, when their lives are sacrificed for profits during COVID-19 by certain employers disregarding their right to safe and healthy work environment. As workers in this country, led by COSATU, and those that are coming from different federations. We are with the people of the United States of America, in particular, Black Americans, as they march throughout the country and calling for the fundamental transformation of the entrenched racism and the unjust justice system. We are saying workers of the world can't breathe for as long as the chains of capitalism are also holding them down against their own dignity. Thank you very much.
The president of COSATU, Zingiswa Losi, just done addressing there now, not just remembering, of course, George Floyd, who was killed at the hands of law enforcement in the United States, but calling out the names of Andres Tatane as well as Collins Koza and others as well, and how this particular government should be dealing with the acts of racism. You recall, of course, in the Northwest, what had obviously been known as the coffin case, which was also, one of the acts here in South Africa, which really questioned how racism is being dealt with in South Africa. Let's go back there again.
The United States has once again brought to the surface the pernicious spectre of racism that permeates our society and many others. It is always there. Sometimes it simmers beneath the surface outside of the public eye, but it's always there. And it is a shameful link between us and other societies all over the world. There are 2 points I'd like to make this evening, and the first is that racism needs to be acknowledged in order to be defeated. It would be hard, for example, to find someone in South Africa, in this country, who would admit to being a racist. But stand in a queue with strangers with a white face on, and that pretense is quickly exposed. Somehow, racists feel that if you are white, you must surely share their prejudice. They feel comfortable to speak loudly with malice and racial slurs as if you are sort of one of them. Part of some sort of secret fellowship, blatantly racist and believing you must share their racism because of how you look. Those are not moments for silence. That is the moment to speak up. So in tackling racism, it first needs to be acknowledged. And those people who would never admit that they are racist, but stand in queues and denigrate others based on the color of their skin, that do not see people different to them as equal or even as human, they should examine their language and their actions and understand the harm, the pain, the humiliation, and the consequential injustices that these words and actions cause. And President Mandela said very eloquently that hatred and racism is learned. We are not born racists. It is learned at home. It's passed on from parent to child. But that also means that it can be unlearned. So the second point I want to make is that racism needs all of us working together in order to defeat it. In the recent days, I read a tweet from our former Deputy President, Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, who is now, of course, the Executive Director of UN Women, where she says, in tackling racism and sexism, we need those who suffer from it and those that never experience it to stand together. So watching the response in the United States to the brutal murder of George Floyd and the scenes of thousands of many, mainly young women and men on the streets of all the major cities in the US, marching to have their voices heard, marching for change and against racism and impunity. It creates a powerful image. These are different and diverse people marching together as one community against the blight of racism. This tragedy perhaps presents an opportunity to think again about the way in which the world tackles its problems. South African foreign policy since democracy has always emphasized the importance of multilateralism, of working together as sovereign countries to solve global problems. Through the institutions of global governance and through the many conventions and conferences on specific issues such as climate change, we can do that. And racism is a global problem. Regrettably, in recent years, several powerful countries in the developed world have moved away from this approach of multilateralism and are looking increasingly inward, adopting isolationist policies, putting up barriers, excluding the other, demonizing foreigners, and essentially abandoning the long discussed and argued, carefully crafted agreements between countries on solving global problems. But the people protesting on the streets with their urgent messages for change suggest to me that they want a different world, a world where people are people, no matter where they come from and what they look like. I hope that governments are listening, that the thousands of people marching for change and against racism, marching as different communities united to fight this battle, will show their governments, especially those governments seeking to withdraw from global accountability, that this is wrong and that their people want a different world, free from hatred and prejudice, free from racism and exclusion, and a world that collaborates to solve its many problems. I hope the governments are listening. Thank you very much.
Well, Sue van der Merwe saying she's hoping that governments are listening around the world to these calls for an end to racism. And generally the discussion that is taking place there today is about what further can be done to address issues of including systematic racism that doesn't just take place in South Africa. I guess the ANC would not be launching this racism campaign this evening if it did not acknowledge. But I think of critical importance here also is on one of the pressing issues, just a few, I would say, minutes or to a half an hour of us conducting that interview with the Khosa family. You would know now that the president says that those responsible for Khosa's death will face the law. The family questioning, of course, how that will happen, given that an SANDF report absolving those SANDF members. Let's go live back there now. You'll see John Gunny is on the podium.
Our people to our people. We, like Yvonne Chaka Chaka, like sports, like Spiro Khumalo, like athletics, we are the people who speak directly and interpret our government and our people's wishes and policies into a finite way where they could understand it. Racism, is instituted. Racism, you pass a law that prohibits other people. Racism is supported at the highest level of governments, which then would take the excuse of enforcing racism in the guise of maintaining law and order. I have been in every country and I have seen in England racial profiling with the stand and search, looking for weapons. Out of every 20, 18 are black. I have seen in America, in the streets where black people and Hispanic and people in non-minorities, they are the people that are affected by racism. What baffles me, I understand that the minorities in America are a small section of the population. When you come to Africa and you get a country that is a majority of African people, and we are grappling with a minority of a minority that is practicing racism against the majority. And then we have to find a way of dealing with that, find a way of even finding legislation to stop that. If you
Well, we seem to have lost a bit of sound on John Kani there, of course, decorated actor, as well as a playwright addressing on issues of racism there. You'd recall, of course, there are many other speakers who are also expected to take to the different areas where they are, of course, doing this virtual launch of the anti-racism campaign. And, of course, director and playwright, Oscar winner, also John Kani. We seem to be struggling slightly a bit there with some of the sound. We hope we're going to take you back there as well. So we will attempt to go back there again. But I think we're going to take you in the next few moments while we sort all of that out, live to Cape Town. And we know that this evening, Cape Town will witness a unique lunar eclipse. Of course, stargazers are in for a treat. Quite unusual. The Earth's main shadow does not cover the moon. Instead, there's a lighter shadow that's cast over the moon by the edge of the Earth's shadow. So this kind of eclipse occurs when the sun, moon and the Earth are imperfectly aligned. So that's what is being noticed here at the moment in Cape Town. We're quickly going to take you back again to that launch of the anti-racism campaign of the ANC. We were hoping to stay on this just a little bit. All right, we're still struggling with some of those visuals there. So starting at about 7:45 this evening, the eclipse, of course, itself was due to reach that point. Let's take you back to our question of the day where we try to sort out our technical problems. We do apologize for that. This relating, of course, to Collins Khoza. You would know that the president in this address now moments ago indicating that justice will be served in the killing of Collins Khoza, saying, of course, that he is very worried by what has taken place, giving an undertaking just moments after the family speaking exclusive here to SABC News, saying they need help. They want the life of Collins Khoza to matter. While we sort out those technical issues, let's take a short break. We hope we'll have it sorted out for you when we get back. A short break now.
From grade 1 up until grade 4, I was bullied about my dark skin complexion. That made me to hate myself. I have learned a lot from SABC. I have learned to respect yourself and respect other people and love yourself. One of the shows that have inspired me is Skim Sam. It shows that no matter challenge that you're going through in life, you can make it. My name is Njabulo Zulu and I'm 13 years old. I am a motivational speaker, a violin player, and anti-bullying activist.
If there's one thing that we have learned from COVID-19 is that we are all in this together.
With everyone being affected with COVID-19, as a show that brings hope and inspiration to the marginalized, the team decided to lead from the front in such trying times.
If you are doing the